Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Apiro. My name is Cody, and welcome back to TechStrong Learning. We've got an exciting presentation ahead, but before we get rolling, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review. First of all, we are recording today's session, so if you happen to miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to watch at a later time, or if you'd like to share with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand, and you'll be getting that email shortly after we conclude this live session today. So if you'd like to engage with us today, there are a couple of options. The first option is the chat tab. You'll find that chat tab on the right side of your screen where we've already got a couple people saying hello. So if you see that chat tab, let us know from where in the world you are joining us. If you have any questions, we do have time set aside at the end to answer all of your questions today. So be sure to send those in to the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of that chat tab. Also today, we will be giving away two $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to see if you're one of our lucky winners. So our topic today is ASPM, leveling the AppSec playing field. And I'm joined today by Patrick Hayes, application security expert at Apiro. So Patrick, thank you so much for joining us here on TechStrong Learning. I'm going to pass the mic on over to you and let you run away with it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Cody. And yeah, absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. My name is Patrick Hayes, and today we'll be presenting on how application security posture management can help you start leveling the AppSec playing field. So I guess to kind of kick things off, I want to put a frame of reference, right? So essentially attackers are thinking in terms of risk, and that may be an obvious statement for some, as attackers are typically aiming to steal sensitive data, essentially in order to achieve financial gain. But why are the conversations I'm having related to application security so vulnerability centric? More often than not, when I ask somebody about their AppSec program, it transpires into a discussion revolving around how they've automated their vulnerability discovery processes with SAST and DAST and SCA, or how they're using these next gen and AI driven techniques that amount to thousands and thousands of vulnerabilities, which is great. But when we start talking about the remediation strategy and the policies that they've defined, well, they're typically rudimentary, focused on specific CWEs or types of issues, using the base CVSS score or whatever severity the tool spits out to define the watermark. I mean, just the other day, I was talking to a financial services institution in the Fortune 500, and their policy was to fix every single vulnerability from critical to low. Ultimately, it was a good conversation, but in the end, it felt more like a therapy session than an AppSec discussion. Now, whether or not this approach has worked in the past is debatable, but well, as we look into the future, where modern application architectures are becoming more complex, relying on interconnected services and developed on ephemeral cloud-native technologies, it makes maintaining visibility near impossible, and I don't really see that as an option moving forward. So when I say attackers think in terms of risk, I'm not simply talking about the SQL injection that they found in an API, or the open source package that contains an RCE vulnerability, or the compromised developer account or CI/CD pipeline. I'm not talking about these siloed and contextless alerts. I'm referring to the vulnerable API that handles sensitive data, that leverages a vulnerable dependency that's located in a code module that's associated with a high business impact application that's ultimately built and deployed to a managed Kubernetes cluster and exposed to the internet. I'm referring to a mapping of interconnected nodes and signals across multiple dimensions that's best described as a risk graph. Now, before I delve into this concept further, I want to take a quick moment to understand how we got here. So, I mean, this is a pretty interesting illustration that I recently came across, mapping the thousands of cybersecurity tools that we have at our disposal. And looking at these tools across all these different dimensions, all these different taxonomies, there's one common denominator. For many of these tools, they all speak the same language, which is vulnerability. And vulnerabilities are certainly a fundamental piece of the equation for calculating risk. But in isolation, vulnerabilities equate to noise, which requires resources, typically manual, to review and triage, which equates to time and money, which you probably don't have an abundance of. And you may be able to manage in a scenario where you have a handful of security resources and a small handful of application, but let's be real, that scenario is probably never going to happen. But, well, what if it did? What if you could find a way to automate classifying risk what exactly would that look like? So I'm sure we're all familiar with the equation risk equals likelihood or probability multiplied by impact or consequence. But if we want to automate this, what attributes could we collect, ideally automatically, to understand the likelihood? Can you determine that if a component, maybe it's a module, service, or dependency, is not part of test code? In fact, it's loaded in memory, meaning is it reachable? Or can you determine that context from the runtime environment? You can determine that the application maybe is deployed or is internet facing. Is it behind a gateway or a WAF? Are there other mitigating controls within the runtime that you have in place? Or lastly, are there vulnerability specific attributes or context that you can gather? Meaning, is that vulnerability, does that have an exploit? Or is that being actively exploited and targeted? If we wanted to do the same thing for impact, we can look at our application inventory. Hopefully, we all have an application inventory, but we can use that to focus on the components that are handling sensitive data, which APIs are using or handling a data model that exposes or involves PII data. Maybe we're looking at findings related to a module that's shared across the enterprise. We have maybe it's a microservice that's across 90% of our portfolio. Or are we talking about, within the context, are we talking about a high business impact application? But automatically stitching these insights together is one piece of the puzzle. But how can you determine, well, how can you determine, but also essentially address risk at scale? That's ultimately what we're trying to do. So when you have to analyze every single feature request and you have to look at every single code change and you have to discern, does that code change introduce a new vulnerability, which up until this point, the industry's done a pretty good job at with the adoption of shift left and integrating security tools into the development process. But not every risk is a vulnerability. Sometimes you also need to understand whether or not that code change is material. Is that change simply fixing a spelling mistake or changing the color in the UI? Or did they introduce a whole new suite of APIs? Or did the development team just change the authentication framework that they're being used? Until recently, material changes have been identified through manual, time-consuming processes like CABs or ARBs, when you essentially perform some sort of interrogation moments before release, which results in really ultimately two things. Either the business is risk accepting or you delay the release. And I mean, typically, right, we all know the outcome of that debate. So when you have a vulnerability or when you have a material change, you still have to quantify, does it introduce a risk and whether or not that risk requires a response. And in the case of a vulnerability, maybe it is a risk, right? Maybe it does require that vulnerability to be prioritized and remediated. Or maybe that's a change that needs to invoke a guardrail. Maybe the development team are just introducing a type of technology that hasn't been approved or is explicitly disallowed by the security team. Or does that change need to invoke an AppSec process or an SDL process like a pen test, or you need to perform an update to your threat model? Or does it change the risk profile completely, right? Maybe now the application is beholden to a completely new compliance standard that it wasn't tied to before. So really what I'm talking about isn't drastically different from what the industry's been doing for the past few years with shift left. I'm simply collecting those insights for likelihood and impact, automatically building a risk graph, then using that risk graph almost as if it were a Rosetta Stone to translate vulnerabilities and code changes into risk, and automatically invoking the appropriate response from security, development, or whomever the stakeholder is that needs to take an action. And it's pretty great to see market validation from analysts like Gartner, who are predicting about half or just under half of the organizations developing software will be adopting ASPM solutions in order to optimize and bring efficiency to their security program. So as you inevitably start your journey down ASPM, let's look at a few criteria to keep in mind as you're making that decision. Now, I won't talk through each one of these, but I'm happy to talk through any of these if you have questions after the fact towards the end. But let's start with thinking about your organization, right? Essentially, let's consider the people, processes, technologies that make up your team. And when we're evaluating ASPM solutions, we have to think about, well, many of these solutions integrate across multiple points of your SDLC, right? When we're talking about deployment and coverage, some of those integrations points are going to be with scanning tools like your SAST and your DAST tools or your SCA tools to collect signals that they're providing And some of these other integration points are going to be used to generate signals natively by that ASPM platform itself. And it's important to understand when we're talking about deployment, how does that solution support a phased approach? Now, we know we can't all go from 0 to 100 overnight. So which integrations are going to be required to get going? Which are mandatory, which are preferred? What insights can be gathered from those integration points? Because if we want to start talking about classifying risk, right, we understand, well, what insights are going to derive or give us insight into likelihood? What integrations are going to give us insights into impact? How can we classify and do that calculation as soon as those changes, as soon as those vulnerabilities are identified, to streamline that administration tail at the end, right? When we have to invoke a process or that we have to focus on a remediation task. Now, another thing to look at within your organization, can you support an agent-based deployment? Based on the people processes that you have in place and the tech stack that your team's adopted, is agentless preferred, or is that the best option for you to go down? And then, do you expect your organization, does that solution expect an organization to already have an inventory, right? I haven't met an enterprise today that's going to bet on their CMDB being accurate and current, but looking at the ASPM platform, is it required, right? Is it prerequisite for you to have a CMDB in place or some sort of asset system, inventory system, or are we looking at an ASPM platform that can cultivate and derive their own inventory and maybe marry with a CMDB that you already have in place? And then the last thing I want to touch on, since we all have different preferences to classify how risk is defined or our risk appetites, we need to consider how flexible the governance and compliance rules are. How extendable is that risk profiling engine? The risk appetite for a financial institution is going to be vastly different compared to a software vendor, and a mature ASPM solution needs the ability to support both. I mean, within the same organization, you're going to have different applications that adhere to different standards. You're going to have maybe high risk applications that have low risk releases. And then you have low risk applications that have changes that were just introduced that constitute a high risk release. Not everything needs to be treated the same. You don't need to take a blanket approach. So understanding how extensive, how customizable, how adaptable, how audible ready these engines are in place when you're talking about a solution is important to take into consideration. And I guess to kind of tie into and share a little bit about Appiro's approach here. So, I mean, step one, it's kind of been a theme, is building out an inventory, right? We need to, from an Appiro standpoint, we start with a simple integration, read-only API directly into your source code management system. And that's what allows us to start building an application inventory on your behalf, right? So we're going to analyze every code repository. We're going to analyze each file, each source file, property, configuration, nondescript file, anything that's available in the code repository to understand, well, what makes up your application? How many APIs do you have? What are your data models, services, modules, dependencies? What are the different technologies that the teams are using? What logging frameworks or authentication or encryption frameworks have teams adopted? Are we starting to see technologies that indicate, hey, this development team or this repository is using cloud technologies? What gateways are they using? What CI/CD platforms? Many insights can be derived directly off that source code. We consider that the source of truth. And once we've built that inventory, the fundamentals of a risk graph, then we can start layering in additional signals. We want to integrate with your SCA tools, with the various security tools that you have in play to pull those vulnerabilities, pull those additional findings, but project them on top of this risk graph, right? Again, we don't want to be looking at vulnerabilities in isolation and just passing up, hey, this SAST tool says it's critical, so it's a critical. We want to be looking at, is it a critical issue in the context of, well, where is it located? Is it on one of my application that's exposed to the internet that generates 80% of the business revenue and is handling credit card information, versus do I have a finding associated with an application that is handling my cafeteria orders, right? Very, very different context. Ultimately, we're an open platform, so we want to either integrate with the tooling that you have, or if there's tooling that you don't have or have yet to deploy, we can use our native solutions, native scanning tools on top of the inventory that we've built out, ultimately providing you that single risk control plane, right? So again, kind of going back to a couple of slides, we want to look at not just the inventory, not just vulnerabilities in isolation, but looking at that in a contextualized way but also looking at what the developers are doing, using the changes, using the events that the developers are introducing to help drive what SDL processes, what security activities uh, the AppSec team or the pen test team or the architecture team needs to perform. So ultimately, we want to help you fix faster and prevent risks as early as we can from getting deployed and having to quote unquote do a risk accept. And to look to a couple of our customers for testimonials, for anecdotes. Looking at that Fortune 100, that financial institution, we were able to use the context, use our inventory, combining it with the scanning tools that they already had in place to help reduce and eliminate over 80% of their backlog. Now, it doesn't mean, hey, we're going through and marking things as false positives or false negatives or TPs or things like that. What we're doing is using the context that we have to bubble up, well, what actually needs to be triaged? What is the 20% of your issues that you actually need to spend manual effort on? Either it's a security engineer or the security champions, the development team leads, if you're implementing a federated model. What are the issues that they need to actually spend their time on, right? Where can we do some level 1 or level 2 triage and connect the dots that you're otherwise manually doing to figure out, is this something that I actually need to spend my time on? Or when we look at one of our customers, GSoft, they were looking at all the different pull requests, all the different changes that the development teams were introducing, trying to get a handle on, well, where do we need to insert ourselves? Where do we need to get involved early on? Because no one wants to find out that a new authentication framework was introduced or a new suite of APIs were introduced Thursday night. And now they have to work through the weekend to make sure those are secure and that they're ready to go versus finding out Monday morning. And then again, when we talk about another Fortune 50 company, we're talking about using the context, using this inventory, this extended software bill of materials, if you will, to understand what do we need to focus on, right? When the next log4j happens and your SCA tool spits out, hey, you have 100 or you have thousands of issues or instances that you found log4j, well, where are those 5% that are actually deployed into a state that they're exploitable? What are those 5% that are internet facing? And how can I use that context to automatically prescribe which findings I look at, which ones I need to immediately fix today or tomorrow, versus which are the 95% that I can remediate through my SOPs, right? So it's using ASPM, essentially using the context and inventory and insights from not just the source code, but also runtime and the build environments to understand and contextualize what are the signals that actually matter, what are the signals that you actually need to focus on. I guess, and with that, I'll take some questions, or I'll look to the Q&A section.
Hey, Patrick, can you hear me?
I can. Yes.
Perfect. So we've received a couple questions, and I also want to call out to our audience that send in any questions you might have, and we'll go ahead and address them here. So Patrick, our first one reads, it sounds like Apiro can build an inventory by analyzing the source code. What if I already have a CMDB? Can Apiro consume information from that?
Yeah. So Apiro certainly can. We do have the ability to pull data from your CMDB. But we're also seeing with customers, we're using the insights that Apiro can gather by analyzing the source code to update their CMDB, right? So everyone knows, I mean, typically CMDBs are based off of manual attestation, manual processes, and you're reliant on that developer or that business owner to, well, A, know what they're doing, and then B, update it proactively, right? And that typically isn't happening. So yes, we can certainly pull in data like business owners or certain aspects or attributes. What I commonly see are things like asset IDs, criticalities, contacts, business contacts primarily. Pulling that into the platform to give you a semblance of, well, hey, who do I need to go talk to when we have an issue, or just having an asset ID for audit purposes, having a record within the platform. But we're also seeing that people are pulling it out of Apiro to update, right? So CMDB record maybe indicates that it's not handling sensitive data, where when we look at the source code, we're seeing data models that indicate you are handling sensitive data, whether it be payment data, PII, something like that. So it's a bit of both, right? It's not just one way or the other. It's using using them in tandem.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. What exactly are business critical risks, and how does ASPM help identify top business critical risks in production right now?
Yeah, so business critical risks, I kind of threw out an example earlier where we're talking about an issue. Maybe it's on a vulnerability from your SAST scan or vulnerability from your SA scan. When you have when you have two SQL injections, one developer maybe only has 15 minutes or an hour to give you, or maybe it's only a few points within their sprint cycle that they can allocate to security. Which ones you ask them to fix, right? Your SAST tool or your scanning tool is probably going to admit, hey, it's a SQL injection, it's a high severity, it's a critical severity. Well, then now you need to go to context. You need to say, well, what's the location that it's in? Is it in an application that's generating revenue for the business? Is it user facing? Is it internet facing? Or is it backend facing? Never going to see the light of day. Maybe it's an internal back office app, or it's handling your food orders, things like that. There's same finding, same vulnerability type, but very much different environments that they exist in. And one, you clearly would want the development team to focus on versus the other. So we're talking about flagging business criticality, right? That's context. Some of that context we can gather from the source code. Some of that context needs to be provided, right? Maybe some compliance standards we can use. We can use insights to define some compliance standards. And then sometimes you need to require business intelligence, right? Like Sarbanes-Oxley, we can't identify if that's going to be a compliance standard based off looking at the code, but that is going to take both an automated approach, looking at source code, looking at runtime environments versus business context, right? Human context that needs to kind of culminate and be married together. And then ultimately using that to derive, well, which issues do you need to focus on? Once you've had that framework, once you have the data in place, you rely on the engine to help prioritize what gets tackled first.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. We're just getting a flood of questions from our audience, so we do have plenty of time here. So our next question reads, what are the key challenges and pain points that organizations face in the current AppSec landscape?
I like that one. Key challenges and pain points. So I look at it on essentially two kind of problems: the front end of the problem and the back end of the problem. When I talk about the front end of the problem, I'm primarily talking about vulnerability discovery, right? Making sure you're either using automated techniques like static analyses or dynamic analyses to identify. Maybe you're doing pen testing, maybe it's a culmination of both, maybe manual code review in addition to automated code review. But the point is, you're applying these techniques to identify vulnerabilities, and that some organizations are having trouble doing that and understanding, well, right, what do I need? If I don't have a mountain of findings, I don't need to figure out what to fix because I don't have any issues to deal with. So that's kind of the front end where I see organizations are trying to understand or scale out these solutions and scale out their vulnerability discovery processes. The second bit, which is very quickly, right, as soon as you address the front end or start addressing the front end of the problem, you're going to have the back end, right? As soon as you start applying vulnerability discovery techniques, you're going to have vulnerability remediation issues, right? Where do you focus your efforts on? Especially given that many of the issues or findings that AppSec identifies requires app dev to address, right? Very, very seldom do you have the AppSec engineer actually being able to fix the issue. And unfortunately, you have AppSec and app dev, the outcomes that they're looking to achieve are orthogonal, right? Security wants to address many of these issues, where application development is going to be focused on time to release, right? How quickly can I get this out the door? KPIs are vastly different, right? If you have success defined for development teams as how frequently your releases are, how quickly can you get new features out the door, uptime, operational time, things like that, very seldom are those KPIs or the definition of success going to include security-centric metrics, right? So that's, I guess those are the points I'm seeing, and that's where ASPM comes into play as well. The front end of the problem, because you can't go from 0 to 100 every single time. That's not going to happen. So when you talk about the front end of the problem and you're trying to understand, well, where do I need to apply these vulnerability discovery techniques? I would want to start with, or at least in the past, I've heard organizations say, I'm going to start with this development team that's a bit friendly. And that's great, right? That's well and good. But what if that friendly development team is working on a very low risk application? I mean, depending on the culture that you have within your org, maybe that is a way to start and get some success. But if you have an inventory, if you have a point of reference, starting your vuln discovery activities on high risk applications is where I would go, right? Starting with your tier 1 apps and then say, hey, your tier 1 apps need to be scanned within the next 3 to 6 months. And then you have your tier 2 apps and your tier 3 apps. So you're phasing out your vuln discovery activities, starting with those that are most critical or handling sensitive data, those that are falling under compliance standards, and then using the same lens almost to prioritize the findings out of those, right? So if you have the development team, and the conversation I had earlier this week, when they say you have to fix everything, the development team's just going to throw you out the window. Say, you know what? I get a risk accept. I got my business owner. He's going to hit he's going to rubber stamp me, and he's going to let me go at the door. And that's going to become the de facto standard. So if you want to continuously risk accept, that's fine. Ask them to fix everything. If you want to actually reduce risk, remove friction between security and development teams, you need to contextualize and ask them what matters. You need to share what that contextualization process is too, right? You need to understand and say, hey, I'm not going to ask you to fix everything. I'm only going to ask you to fix the things that matter. So when I come to you, I've already done this triage. I've already done 2 or 3 steps for you. I'm not asking you to fix everything under the sun. These are the things that I actually need you to care about. So I think those are the biggest challenges I'm seeing, is both from a technical standpoint, but more so from a philosophical, from a cultural standpoint, I think is the biggest challenge.
When we had a participant comment, I guess on the business standpoint, besides the time to fix vulnerabilities, there's also the cost associated with them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Fixing something later in the game, I forget, there's a bunch of studies out there, but some folks say 40x, some say 100x. I think we can all agree, yeah, fixing something that's made its way to production is going to cost way more than catching it as the development teams are introducing it during the pull request.
Yep, absolutely. So Patrick, our next question reads, does Apiro integrate with Azure DevOps boards for ticketing? And if so, is it bidirectional?
We do, yep. We integrate with ADO boards. We can cut tickets. With bidirectional, that means different things to different people. I will say we pull in states and we show you what tickets have been cut. Does an issue have a ticket associated with it? We give you tracking on that. But things like comments, right? If developer comments on a ticket, we're not going to consume that and surface that in the platform.
So what are some core business benefits of ASPM?
Core business benefits. Well, I mean, we talked about fixing faster, time to fix, or mean time to remediate is the metric I prefer to classify it as. But when we talk about mean time to remediate and asking the development team to fix the things that matter, in a way, I'm asking them to focus less on security, right? If you have a tool or whatever report that says, hey, these are 100 things, but you're able to use the ASPM platform, the ASPM solution, to contextualize and say, hey, out of those 100, these are the 5, these are the 10 that you actually need to focus on. So from a business standpoint, you're helping the development teams move faster, right? By asking them to do less to focus on less. Maybe it's counterintuitive at first, but you're actually accelerating development as a result of that, reducing risk in the process.
So how can my organization operationalize ASPM? How do we get started?
Well, so when we start off, it's, at least from a Piro standpoint, from my standpoint, what I've seen successful, phase one is to build out the fundamentals. Build out an inventory, start building the foundational nodes that's going to culminate into eventually what's going to culminate into a risk graph. Understanding the application profiles. What I mean by that is not just having a spreadsheet and saying, hey, app A is PCI, app B is PII, app C is nothing. But actually being able to very intimately delve into these applications and understand, well, what are all the endpoints, right? Does this application even have REST endpoints, API endpoints that we expose to end users? Or does it, right? More often than not, it probably will. But understanding all the endpoints, not just what's documented, but what exists within the source code, what type of data it's handling, and specifically where, right? Not just, hey, it handles PII data, but what are the APIs that are actually exposing that? Is it get methods? Is it put methods? So building a very intimate understanding inventory is, I think, the first step into understanding. Using an inventory to understand both the applications, but also the developer behavior, I think is key in that as well. Understanding, well, which developers are doing what, because we have to look at it from a cultural standpoint, right? It's not just giving you technology and forcing people to use it. It's trying to instill a positive culture around it, right? You want to reduce friction between the security and development team. So, I guess to phase one, build an inventory, try to require less of the development team up front, right? They don't necessarily need to know that you're building an inventory, that you're starting this. And then when they start seeing things, right? Oh, I guess I shouldn't jump that step. Don't expect them to log into the platform, right? You don't want to give them another tool and expect them to log into another UI. You want to let them know, hey, we're doing this new approach, or we're taking a new approach where we're contextualizing findings. So the things that I'm going to cut into your backlog, whether it be ADO boards or Jira or whatever, I've already kind of triaged for you. So I'm not going to push everything into you. I'm going to reduce the noise. So the things that come in there, this is what I'm doing. This is how I'm triaging it. This is how I'm getting things that actually need to be addressed into your ticket. I'm using a funnel to kind of filter out exactly what needs to go. But I need to ask in return, when you get a ticket, I need you to prioritize it and work on it. So I'm doing effort on the front end to reduce the effort on the back end, but ultimately what comes to you, I need you to focus on. So it's a phased approach, build an inventory, start bringing in additional signals, whether it be integrating with security tools or using native solutions within the platforms, and then start piping that to development teams.
Awesome. That sounds like a pretty good roadmap to get started. So if anyone's got any more questions about those steps, feel free to send those on in. Moving on to our next question, Patrick. How do we write policies that span across the context of different data sources and infrastructure? For example, software composition analysis and cloud security posture management issues look different.
How do we policies?
I can actually put that on the screen so everyone can read it.
So when we look at that, yeah, they're really orthogonal. I think data sensitivity compliance is probably where I would start with, because although findings are not going to have similar taxonomy, it's going to help me prioritize, well, what is, like, my point being, if an SCA tool says it's critical, or if your CSPM tool says it's critical, there's context that needs to be applied. There's not, right, not everything is critical, not everything is a nail, not everything's a hammer. So when you use the context of, well, what's deployed on this particular cluster, what's deployed in this image, or this module that your SCA solution just scanned, using that to derive what policies are written. So I wouldn't say, hey, everything that's critical needs to be addressed. I wouldn't use blanket statements like that, right? Just focusing on severity. I would want to look for things like toxic combinations, where if you have an OSS finding from your SCA tool, is it fixable? Does it associated with a business critical application, or is it something that is handling sensitive data? Are there known exploits available? So I would start using insights to try and classify what is that. I wouldn't want to put together like a blanket policy that just says, hey, thou shall fix criticals, highs, mediums.
All right, so it looks like we've got just a few more questions remaining. So if you've got any more, send them on in. Patrick, I'm going to go ahead and put this on the screen. How would automated remediation workflows and developer guardrails work? I mean, you change the code or apply some security control on WAF, API gateways, etc.
How do they work? Well, I think it depends if your organization has chosen to do GitOps or ClickOps. If you're letting them go into the console and just click things, then that's going to be rather challenging. I guess RBAC would be your best bet. But when we're talking about organizations that have essentially adopted everything as code, everything's code, right? So as soon as a developer changes a gateway configuration and introduces that and makes that commit into the repository, whether it be Terraform or what have you, that's where you can start getting that signal. So if they're doing ClickOps, that's going to be I think that's your first thing, is trying to get them from doing ClickOps to GitOps. But once they start using code, once they start defining everything, policy as code, infrastructure as code, all that good stuff, that's when you can start leveraging the workflows and digging into things like that.
Perfect. What makes a code change material, and how does ASPM streamline material code change detection?
That's a great question, because ideally that's defined by you. What is material? It's a bit nebulous, it's hard to get going, but if I were to kind of put it in a frame of reference, if you go to the development team and maybe you're just going to the development team and you're asking, hey, what are you guys working on? If you are saying, hey, let me know, Bob, Ed, or Sue, if you do these 6 things. If you're working on a new API, if you're thinking about a new authentication framework or whatever it may be, if you're doing these 6 things, let me know. That's a great example to say, hey, let's take those 6 things and define them and workflows and policies to say, okay, if these 6 things occur, I consider that material, right? Some organizations I've worked with have a different risk appetite than others, and they say, okay, every single API that gets added, I want to know about it. Where some organizations say, well, I don't want to know about every single API, I just want to know about the APIs that touch sensitive data. So, right, one organization may consider any API material versus other organizations are going to look at and say, well, only if an API is missing input validation, or only if an API exposes payment data. But ultimately, it's how I'm defining material is if you're defining, or if you're asking these questions during the change advisory board or looking at the ARBs, and you say, okay, if you do this thing, I need to provide this response. That is how I would essentially define something as material, and then use the code to signal if that change has occurred.
Perfect. So Patrick, we did get a question here about how Apiro tracks developers and the developers that generate issues, what kind of issues they create. Does Apiro do any kind of tracking as far as who contributes what code and maybe who might need that additional training?
No, it's exactly that. So what Apiro does, when we integrate with the source code management system, Apiro analyzes, right? If you integrate day 0, Apiro is going to analyze historical commits, right? We're going to go back in time and look at all the commits that have led up into this point. When we look at a commit, we're certainly analyzing what is the change encompass. Is it a new method? Is it a new data model? Is it a new class? Is it a new dependency? What does that change encompass? But we're also tracking who's the developer, who's the contributor that introduced that change. So when we build an inventory, when we look at a repo, when we build an inventory of, hey, these are your 85 APIs, your 1,000 dependencies, this is where your data models are, this is where your secrets, etc. we're also looking at it through the lens of a developer, right? So you can look at that through a lens of a repo and look at all the inventory components for a repo, or you can say, hey, let me look at this particular developer. Let me go look at Bob. What has he been doing? Does he work on 5 repos? Does he work on 1 repo? What is the material change that he did yesterday or 2 years ago? So we're building out those developer profiles. It's just looking at the data through a different lens, so to speak. And then when you look at the developer behavior, you can say, hey, is this person introducing APIs? Is this person introducing APIs and consistently missing authorization? Are they introducing secrets, right? So you can use some of those behavioral aspects, some of those tendencies to drive training and say, hey, this is the developers introducing APIs or excuse me, developing APIs that work in Java, right? These are the developers that are working in .NET. These are the ones that work on authentication and RBAC controls. So you can use what they're doing to help put more pinpoint in essentially, yeah, more pinpoint curriculums for them. Not just you got to take these 10 classes and 5 of them don't even apply to what you're doing.
All right. Well, Patrick, I've been saving this question for the last because I think it really kind of tees up to an open question for you. So application security posture management is a middleware interface between users and integrations of dozens of tools. So once implemented, it becomes very difficult to change. There have been moves in this space with Sneak acquiring Enzo and CrowdStrike acquiring Bionic. What do you think is the industry's future?
Buy a platform or standalone solution? Well, it's similar. I look at it through kind of cloud adoption. Do you want to put all your eggs in one basket and be beholden to that one vendor and whatever they decide to do in the future, or do you want to be a little bit more agnostic and flexible? I think it's important to also consider, well, what solutions does that vendor provide? If we look at Enzo right now being applied to Sneak, is that going to hinder their integration portfolio, right? Is a Veracode, is a Checkmarks, is a Shift Left or Quiet going to want to work with them now that they're working with Sneak? So I guess you have to kind of consider your organization, look at your tech stack, the people that you have in place and the processes that those technologies would best serve, and understand, is that, do I want to go all in on one vendor? Do I want to go best of breed and have the best SAST tool, the best SCA tool? I think ultimately an ASPM solution that's going to do well is one that's open and flexible and doesn't lock you into a certain tech stack or a certain solution set. Allows you to choose what's right for you. Because I mean, if we want to start going down that road, I don't know if you need to be running the same SaaS solution, the same commercial SaaS solution on every single application. I mentioned earlier where you may have like a tier 1 set, a tier 2, a tier 3. Well, maybe your tier 1 set gets the big box tool, right? If it's $10,000 or $100,000 to scan your tier 1 apps, that's another 100,000 that you'd have to spend on your tier 2 apps or your tier 3 apps. Well, what if I could say, I'll use a commercial tool, I'll use my big box tool on tier 1, I'll use something open source on tier 2. In tier 3, maybe I'll use open source as well or something different. It allows you to be more, allows you to right size your footprint with that particular technology. So yeah, I think an open solution that provides you flexibility is the direction that we're going.
All right. And if we do need to have someone who owns application security, who in the organization should own AppSec?
What I've seen generally goes up to the CISO, but I mean, I mentioned this earlier, nothing gets done without app dev's involvement. So I don't know if it's going to be or should be owned by the CIO. I don't necessarily think that at all, but it definitely is a partner that needs to be bought in, right? So it needs to be a multi-organizational kind of facet. Maybe it's funded through the CISO team, but you're going to have multiple users or at least multiple consumers of that solution.
All right, Patrick. Well, it looks like we have run out of questions here. So I do want to give you the opportunity to leave us with any parting thoughts. If you have any promotional message you'd like to leave us with, or anything at all. I'm going to give you the floor here one last time. Anything on the top of your head?
No, I mean, I just appreciate everyone's time today. It's a new, exciting space wherein I can remember years ago when SAST was a new and novel concept, and everyone was used to their manual code reviews and doing that once a year, and then have evolve and adapt. And I think we're at a point where this software security or AppSec needs to evolve and adapt again, right? We were able to develop automated solutions to keep up with the pace of development, the velocity of development. We needed to adopt SAST and SCA and DAST techniques. But now we need to evolve and contextualize those findings, right? We're finding more than we can fix, so we need to understand, well, what actually matters and focus on that.
Well, all right, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us here on Tech Strong Learning. It was a pleasure getting to speak with you before we went live, and a pleasure to learn from you over this last hour. So once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Cody.
So to our audience, just a quick reminder that we have recorded our session today. You will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find it on the DevOps website. That's devops.com/webinars, and it will be in the on-demand section. The two winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Lisa M. and Erica S. So keep an eye on your inbox. You'll be receiving an email from me shortly to get these gift cards distributed. If you don't see an email, check your spam folder just in case it happens to be filtered out. I'd like to thank Apiro for sponsoring our program today. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. Pinned to the top of the chat, you'll see a link to our post-webinar survey. Feel free to click that. Let us know your thoughts about our program today, or if you have suggestions for future topics, we would love to hear from you. Either way, we hope to see everyone at a future Tech Strong Learning experience. Have a great day, and you may now disconnect. Patrick, thanks again.